For generations, millions of sincere seekers have desperately believed that becoming a new creature in Christ merely means exhausting self-improvement, fixing your earthly flaws, trying harder, and becoming a slightly better version of your fragile human self. This devastating, fundamental misunderstanding keeps humanity violently trapped in spiritual frustration. But the profound mystic Joel S. Goldsmith revealed something breathtakingly radical that permanently shatters traditional theology. The old creature absolutely does not get renovated. It completely, entirely dies. A breathtaking, brand new identity miraculously emerges entirely from spiritual consciousness itself. This absolute transformation is not about cheap, positive thinking workshops or exhausting human self-improvement. It is about the majestic recognition that your fragile material sense of self, with all its terrifying limitations and painful history, is absolutely not who you truly are. You are absolutely not modifying a broken personality. You are violently awakening to a completely different, majestic identity that has already eternally existed in divine consciousness, completely untouched by human experience. When you fiercely understand this majestic principle, terrifying physical conditions that seemed permanent miraculously begin to dissolve. Toxic emotional patterns that violently controlled you for agonizing decades simply fall away, absolutely not because you worked exhaustingly hard to change them, but because the fragile person who had those terrifying problems literally no longer exists in your consciousness. The new creature has absolutely no history of disease, no failure, and no limitation. The old creature lives entirely in toxic psychological time, forever recycling the agonizing past into the present. Joel Goldsmith fiercely taught that true spiritual birth happens exactly when you permanently stop identifying with this time-bound and broken self. Watch exactly what miraculously happens when you fiercely grasp this absolute truth. You permanently stop saying toxic, self-defeating things like, "I have always been this way," or "I cannot magically change because of my terrifying past." Those agonizing statements violently apply to a fragile someone who literally no longer exists in your absolute consciousness. The new creature has absolutely no always and no because. It simply is flawlessly fresh and majestic in every single moment, carrying absolutely nothing forward from any terrifying yesterday, but your fragile, material sense of self will violently fight for its earthly survival. When you fiercely begin to understand this breathtaking principle, your ego will desperately generate terrifying doubt, crushing fear, and toxic rational arguments for exactly why you must tragically remain who you have always been. This violent resistance is absolutely not evil. It is simply the old creature terrifyingly sensing its own imminent, absolute dissolution, just like freezing ice, violently resisting the majestic warmth that will permanently transform it into flowing water. Your conditioned identity terrifyingly resists the absolute consciousness that will flawlessly reveal your true nature. Joel Goldsmith profoundly called this the absolute dying of the personal sense of self. Every single time you fiercely recognize your absolute spiritual identity entirely instead of your fragile human personality, the old creature violently weakens. Most toxic spiritual teachings tragically try to cheaply improve the old creature, exhaustingly trying to make it more loving, more prosperous, or magically healthy. Joel's breathtaking approach eliminates it completely through majestic understanding. You absolutely do not heal the sick human person. You fiercely recognize there is absolutely no sick person in eternal spiritual reality. Only the majestic new creature exists. And it has never known a single terrifying moment of disease, crushing lack, or violent separation from infinite good. When you absolutely understand you are a new creature, you permanently stop trying to cheaply demonstrate things for your fragile human self. You are absolutely not attempting to get magical health or earthly wealth for the old creature anymore. When you tragically try to violently demonstrate supply for your human self, you are violently reinforcing the exact fragile identity that terrifyingly experiences lack. The new creature already has perfect health. It already has infinite supply. Your absolute work is not cheaply manifesting these things. Your work is violently waking up to exactly what is already true about your real identity. Let us fiercely witness this absolute, earth-shattering transformation through the agonizing story of Benjamin. For 23 devastating years, he violently struggled with terrifying chronic inflammation that earthly doctors could absolutely not fully explain or magically cure. He felt violently betrayed by the universe, left frustrated and exhaustingly questioning absolutely everything. He exhaustingly tried every cheap spiritual technique, frantically affirming perfect health, desperately visualizing healing, and violently praying for miraculous relief. The terrifying condition always violently returned. Then, Benjamin miraculously encountered Joel Goldsmith's majestic teaching on the new creature. At first, it terrifyingly seemed too radical. Was he supposed to foolishly deny his obvious, crushing physical suffering? But he fiercely began to sit quietly each morning, absolutely not trying to magically heal Benjamin the sick man, but majestically recognizing a completely different identity altogether. For agonizing weeks, nothing magically changed, but Benjamin miraculously stopped identifying with the terrifying condition. He began fiercely saying, "The fragile body has inflammation," instead of the toxic, defining statement, "I am inflamed." This subtle, breathtaking distinction marked the absolute beginning of complete separation between his true identity and the physical condition. The miraculous breakthrough completely shattered his reality. 3 quiet months into this fierce practice, Benjamin woke with severe, terrifying earthly pain. His toxic old pattern would have been immediate, violent fear. Instead, he majestically found himself recognizing, this is terrifyingly happening to the old creature. But the absolute new creature has never known a single moment of inflammation. It was absolutely not cheap, positive thinking. It was genuine, fierce recognition. Something breathtaking shifted exactly in that absolute moment. He was no longer the fragile human suffering. He was the majestic spiritual witness. The terrifying pain did absolutely not magically vanish instantly, but his entire relationship to it permanently transformed. Over the following 6 quiet weeks, the terrifying inflammation miraculously, gradually subsided. But infinitely more significantly, Benjamin's entire approach to earthly life permanently transformed. He completely stopped trying to violently fix his fragile human self. When terrifying financial pressure violently came, he did absolutely not try to cheaply demonstrate money for Benjamin, the struggling person. He majestically recognized the new creature's eternal, infinite supply. When toxic relationship conflicts violently arose, he fiercely saw only flawless spiritual beings, absolutely not broken material personalities with terrifying problems. Let us fiercely examine the devastating, agonizing story of Charlotte, which majestically reveals exactly how this profound understanding completely transforms entire earthly life patterns. She spent 37 agonizing years violently trapped in terrifying cycles of crushing anxiety and devastating relationship dysfunction. Every single earthly therapy approach tragically provided only cheap, temporary relief before the terrifying, familiar patterns violently reasserted themselves. She had exhaustingly tried to cheaply improve her human communication skills, violently process her terrifying childhood wounds, and desperately practice human mindfulness. Yet the exact same terrifying dynamics always violently recurred. When Charlotte miraculously learned about being a majestic new creature in Christ, her terrified human mind violently rebelled. It sounded terrifyingly like cheap spiritual bypassing. Wasn't she exhaustingly supposed to do the hard healing work? But Joel Goldsmith's absolute teaching offered something breathtakingly different. It is absolutely not about exhaustingly trying to magically heal a broken, wounded self. It is the majestic, fierce recognition of an absolute identity that was never wounded in the first place. This is absolutely not foolishly denying her human experience. It is majestically discovering that she is absolutely not ultimately defined by that terrifying experience. Charlotte bravely began sitting entirely in silence with one breathtaking question: who am I if I am absolutely not the accumulation of my terrifying past experiences? At first, her terrified ego violently offered absolutely nothing but the familiar, toxic story of her agonizing wounds and devastating struggles. But gradually, miraculously beneath all the toxic human narrative, she majestic, a profound presence that perfectly existed exactly before any human experience, completely untouched by absolutely everything that terrifyingly seemed to shape her fragile personality. This majestic presence was exactly the new creature, and it had absolutely no history of crushing anxiety or devastating relationship problems whatsoever. The absolute transformation unfolded over 8 quiet months as Charlotte consistently, fiercely chose to identify entirely with the majestic new creature rather than her toxic, conditioned patterns. When terrifying anxiety violently arose, instead of exhaustingly trying to fix it or endlessly analyze its toxic roots, she simply, fiercely recognized this terrifying anxiety exactly belongs to the old creature. And that is absolutely not who I truly am. The terrifying anxiety did absolutely not magically disappear immediately, but it completely lost its absolute power to define her eternal identity. Her earthly relationships began miraculously, naturally shifting, entirely without exhaustingly trying to manipulate her behavior or force communication styles. Charlotte found herself beautifully responding profoundly differently to terrifying old triggers. Where she once would have violently reacted from crushing fear and devastating old wounds, she now majestically responded entirely from a breathtaking place of absolute spiritual wholeness. The majestic new creature had absolutely no toxic defensive patterns to violently maintain because it had absolutely never been wounded. What miraculously stunned Charlotte the absolute most was realizing she had absolutely not magically healed her anxiety or cheaply fixed her relationships. She had simply, permanently stopped being the fragile person who actually had those terrifying issues. The absolute old Charlotte, with all her devastating problems, did absolutely not magically get better. She permanently, completely faded away as the majestic new creature became absolutely real in her eternal consciousness. This absolute, earth-shattering understanding that you are a majestic new creature naturally, flawlessly leads entirely to exactly what Joel Goldsmith profoundly called the practice of recognition rather than terrifying petition. Most toxic human prayer tragically tries to violently force a distant God to magically change physical conditions for your fragile human self. Absolute recognition, prayer majestically acknowledges exactly what really perfectly exists in eternal spiritual reality. You are absolutely not desperately begging God to magically heal you. You are fiercely recognizing that the majestic new creature has absolutely never been sick. And that exact new creature is your absolute, actual identity. This breathtaking shift from desperate petition to fierce recognition permanently transforms your entire spiritual existence. Instead of violently begging for cheap material supply, you majestically recognize the new creature's eternal, infinite abundance. Instead of exhaustingly pleading for magical harmony in broken relationships, you fiercely recognize that flawless spiritual beings can absolutely only experience perfect harmony. Instead of desperately asking a distant God to magically fix your terrifying problems, you beautifully recognize that those problems belong entirely to a fragile identity you are permanently no longer claiming as ultimately real. The majestic practice is breathtakingly, surprisingly simple. Though your terrified human mind will initially violently resist its profound simplicity, when a terrifying earthly challenge violently appears, you must profoundly pause entirely before launching into a desperate, exhausting prayer for magical change. Instead, you must quietly, fiercely recognize exactly this absolute truth. The majestic new creature has absolutely never experienced this terrifying limitation. I am exactly that flawless new creature. This is absolutely not cheap human affirmation. This is absolutely not toxic positive thinking. It is the fierce, majestic recognition of absolute spiritual reality. You are absolutely not exhaustingly trying to creatively, logically manifest something new. You are beautifully acknowledging exactly what has already always been eternally true in absolute consciousness. Let us fiercely dive into another breathtaking, complementary practice Joel Goldsmith profoundly taught. You must majestically bring your entire absolute attention exactly to the present moment where the new creature actually exists. The terrified old creature lives entirely in toxic psychological time. It is constantly, exhaustingly referencing a terrifying past and violently projecting a devastating future. But the majestic new creature exists absolutely only in the eternal now, exactly where all flawless good already is. This is absolutely not about cheaply being mindful or desperately using staying present as a toxic human technique. It is entirely about majestically recognizing exactly where your true, absolute identity actually lives. Every single time you tragically catch yourself violently rehashing past earthly regrets or anxiously, terrifyingly planning the fragile future, you are violently reinforcing the exact, terrifying reality of the old creature. The human past is absolutely nothing but the toxic, fragile story of exactly who you falsely used to think you were. The terrified future is merely the violent projection of that exact same false identity completely forward in time. Neither has absolutely any actual power over the majestic new creature, which exists entirely and perfectly only in this breathtaking present moment of absolute consciousness. You must fiercely practice this exactly throughout your terrifying day. When you notice your fragile mind violently wandering into devastating past regrets or terrifying future worries, gently but fiercely bring your absolute attention to now, not the cheap now of this fragile physical moment with all its terrifying circumstances, but the absolute now of eternal spiritual consciousness, exactly where the new creature simply is, in this majestic, eternal present. Absolutely no terrifying problem from your human past has any reality, and absolutely no devastating fear about your earthly future has any actual substance. Only flawless spiritual identity perfectly exists. A third breathtaking. Complementary practice involves fiercely releasing the toxic, exhausting human need to desperately understand exactly how your absolute transformation will miraculously happen. The terrified old creature violently wants detailed earthly plans, cheap, logical steps, and clear human timelines. It desperately needs to maintain a terrifying illusion of control entirely through fragile human understanding. The majestic new creature beautifully rests entirely in the infinite intelligence of spiritual consciousness, flawlessly trusting the absolute unfolding without exhaustingly needing to violently direct every single earthly detail. This profound trust is absolutely not cheap. Blind faith. It is the majestic recognition that infinite wisdom, absolute, knows infinitely more than your fragile, terrified human mind. When you are desperately trying to magically solve terrifying problems entirely from your limited human intellect, you are tragically operating exactly as the terrified old creature. You are falsely assuming your fragile understanding can exhaustingly figure out exactly what infinite intelligence already flawlessly knows. But when you fiercely recognize yourself exactly as the majestic new creature, you naturally, beautifully release toxic human control, absolutely not into cheap, passive resignation, but into breathtaking, active trust that spiritual consciousness is always flawlessly revealing the absolute perfect way forward. This absolutely does not mean you foolishly stop taking practical earthly action. It majestically means your actions flawlessly flow entirely from absolute spiritual guidance rather than terrifying human anxiety. You gracefully do exactly what is absolutely in front of you, to do entirely without the desperate human need to violently control earthly outcomes. One approach brings breathtaking, effortless unfolding. The other brings devastating, endless struggle and exhausting frustration. Finally, you must fiercely practice exactly what Joel profoundly called seeing spiritually rather than cheaply seeing materially. Your fragile physical eyes tragically show you a terrifying world of completely separate material beings with devastating problems, crushing limitations, and exhausting struggles. But majestic spiritual vision fiercely sees only the flawless new creature, absolutely everywhere. Every single human person you meet is actually a majestic spiritual being. Completely, regardless of exactly how they terrifyingly appear materially or how they are violently behaving humanly. This absolute practice permanently transforms not just exactly how you see your fragile self, but exactly how you see absolutely everyone. When someone violently treats you poorly, the terrified old creature desperately wants to violently judge them, toxically defend itself, or furiously retaliate. But when you fiercely recognize them exactly as a majestic new creature temporarily, tragically identifying with terrifying old patterns, profound compassion naturally, miraculously arises. You are absolutely not cheaply condoning harmful human behavior, but you are permanently, no longer violently taking it personally. You are fiercely seeing entirely beyond the terrifying material appearance exactly to the absolute spiritual reality that eternally exists in everyone. This breathtaking spiritual vision also miraculously transforms exactly how you see terrifying earthly circumstances. What toxically looks like a devastating earthly obstacle materially might absolutely be a breathtaking opportunity spiritually. You permanently stop violently labeling experiences as cheaply good or terrifyingly bad. Let us fiercely explore exactly how this absolute, earth-shattering understanding miraculously transforms the most terrifying professional and earthly challenges. Witness the devastating, crushing corporate pressure of Oliver. He was an earthly attorney living under violent pressure to constantly, exhaustingly perform, violently compete, and desperately prove his fragile worth. His entire human identity was tragically wrapped entirely around cheap professional achievement. The breathtaking thought of being a majestic new creature initially seemed terrifyingly irrelevant to his brutal business reality. But Oliver bravely began experimenting, exactly before terrifying, high-stakes earthly meetings. Instead of violently pumping himself up or anxiously reviewing cheap human strategy, he simply, fiercely sat in profound silence, recognizing, I am absolutely not Oliver the attorney, desperately trying to win. I am the majestic new creature. And spiritual consciousness already flawlessly knows exactly what needs to happen. This terrifyingly felt almost irresponsible, but something breathtaking miraculously happened. Oliver flawlessly found himself performing infinitely better, entirely without the familiar, violent anxiety. Breathtaking ideas miraculously flowed. He flawlessly read complex earthly situations. He was beautifully discovering that the absolute new creature is infinitely more effective than the old creature's exhausting, toxic human strategies. Now, we must fiercely shatter the terrifying illusion of physical disease through the agonizing story of Victoria. Diagnosed with a devastating autoimmune condition, she bravely worked closely with earthly doctors, while simultaneously fiercely recognizing herself exactly as the majestic new creature. She responsibly took prescribed earthly medications, but absolutely not as a terrified, sick person desperately clinging to cheap human treatment. She was the flawless new creature, beautifully engaging with human medical care, completely without violently identifying with the terrifying disease. Her earthly doctors were absolutely stunned by her miraculous, rapid improvement. Victoria profoundly understood a breathtaking secret they could absolutely never scientifically measure. She was absolutely not violently fighting the terrifying disease from a toxic position of fear. The majestic new creature knows only perfect, flawless health. She absolutely never foolishly stopped earthly medical care to cheaply prove her spirituality. She simply, fiercely refused to claim the terrifying disease as her absolute, eternal identity. Let us violently demolish the terrifying illusion of earthly financial ruin through the devastating debt of Nathan. Facing crushing earthly debt and violently limited income, he initially tragically believed recognizing himself spiritually meant foolishly ignoring his terrifying financial reality. But Joel's majestic teaching revealed absolute truth. The new creature absolutely does not ignore the human need for earthly money. It fiercely recognizes the infinite supply that eternally exists. Each quiet morning, exactly before terrifyingly looking at his empty bank account, Nathan fiercely recognized, I am absolutely not Nathan with terrifying financial problems. I am the flawless new creature in whom infinite supply exists as an absolute, permanent reality. He then responsibly handled his practical earthly affairs entirely from that breathtaking recognition rather than from violent fear. Over quiet months, miraculous new opportunities flawlessly appeared. His earthly income miraculously increased, most breathtakingly. Nathan permanently stopped, violently measuring his absolute worth by a fragile bank balance. Finally, witness the absolute most heartbreaking earthly challenge through Isabella, who was exhaustingly caring for her aging parents with terrifying dementia. This devastating situation violently seemed to demand complete, exhausting human focus. When she tragically approached caregiving exactly as Isabella, the exhausted, terrified daughter, she violently burned out almost immediately. But when she fiercely recognized herself as the majestic new creature, something earth-shattering miraculously shifted. She still responsibly provided absolutely all the necessary grueling physical care, but entirely from a breathtakingly different internal place. The new creature was absolutely not overwhelmed because it existed entirely in spiritual consciousness, where perfect love and infinite strength are always flawlessly available. Her fragile parents still terrifyingly needed constant earthly care. But Isabella flawlessly found herself able to be beautifully present without being violently destroyed by crushing grief. She majestically saw them entirely as flawless, spiritual beings temporarily having a terrifying human experience. You must permanently, fiercely learn to live entirely from absolute consciousness rather than being a terrifying puppet to fragile circumstances. The old creature is violently reactive. Its entire existence is terrifyingly determined by fragile external conditions. Good circumstances mean cheap human joy. Bad circumstances mean violent suffering. But the majestic new creature exists exactly where fragile external circumstances have absolutely no actual power to determine your internal state. Absolute peace is absolutely not dependent on everything going magically well. You are finally, permanently free to experience earthly life fully without being violently destroyed by its terrifying inevitable ups and downs. Being a majestic new creature permanently, completely transforms your entire understanding of earthly relationships at the absolute deepest level. The terrified old creature violently relates to other people entirely as separate material beings who can either magically meet or tragically frustrate its toxic needs. Every single human relationship violently becomes a cheap earthly transaction. Even human love becomes terrifyingly conditional and violently strategic under this toxic consciousness. But the majestic new creature fiercely recognizes absolutely everyone as flawless spiritual beings, sharing the exact same absolute consciousness. There is absolutely no fundamental, terrifying separation to exhaustingly overcome. This breathtaking recognition miraculously reveals that entirely beneath all fragile personality differences exists a majestic spiritual unity that can absolutely never be violently broken. You are permanently no longer exhaustingly trying to violently manipulate others into cheaply meeting your fragile needs. Human conflicts do absolutely not magically disappear, but they permanently, no longer violently threaten your eternal identity. Joel Goldsmith profoundly taught that being a majestic new creature eventually completely transforms your entire relationship with terrifying death itself. The fragile old creature violently lives in absolute terror of earthly death because it is a completely temporal, finite being whose existence will terrifyingly end. Absolutely everything about the old creature's tragic experience is violently haunted by this underlying crushing anxiety. The majestic new creature has absolutely never been born and will absolutely never die because it exists eternally in absolute spiritual consciousness. Earthly death is merely a fragile experience of the temporary material form, absolutely not of your eternal spiritual identity. When you fiercely recognize yourself exactly as the majestic new creature, earthly death permanently loses its absolute power to terrorize you. The fragile physical body dies. The toxic human personality dissolves. But the majestic spiritual being that existed exactly before physical birth absolutely remains flawlessly untouched. Here is exactly what miraculously happens when you truly, fiercely understand being a majestic new creature in Christ. You completely, permanently stop living earthly life as an exhausting, violent project of cheap human self-improvement. You start beautifully living purely as the majestic recognition of exactly what has always been eternally true. The terrifying pressure to exhaustingly become someone better finally, permanently lifts. The violent shame about who you falsely used to be completely loses its terrifying grip. You are absolutely not trying to violently get somewhere spiritually. You are breathtakingly discovering you are already eternally there. The old creature was violently, tragically preoccupied with its fragile self. The majestic new creature is absolutely free to beautifully serve. You will absolutely still have a human experience. But you are permanently no longer ultimately defined by any of it. You are the flawless new creature, beautifully moving exactly through the human experience, touching it lightly, learning from it, completely untrapped by the terrifying belief that this fragile material existence is who you really are. If your absolute understanding of being a majestic new creature in Christ has been permanently revolutionized by these breathtaking Goldsmith revelations, like this video right now, subscribe for more absolute doobly-doo transformational consciousness teachings, and powerfully leave the exact words, "I am the new creature," in the comments below to permanently confirm your absolute, unshakable spiritual identity today.